stop the $400 billion heist that blinded the USSR. You think Project Azorian was a science stunt? It was. The mining ship was a lie, the Hughes Glomar Explorer a mask, and the steel claw below, Clementine, was built to steal a dead Soviet sub from 3 miles down. If they pulled K-129 clean, Moscow's Torpedoes, metallurgy, and comm gear became American homework. The ledger, shell companies, a submersible barge, HMB-1, built to hide a secret, and SOSUS hydrophones that fixed a grave on the seafloor. The lift worked until the sub broke in the sky. 3 reveals set this off. The SOSUS triangulation, the Hughes cover story, the fracture. Here's the bite. Did a fake mining industry and one impossible lift quietly blind the Soviet Union? Not with bombs, through doubt. Once your enemy might read your traffic or knows how your boats are built, every radio check feels like a risk you can't measure. The human stakes were real. K-129 vanished in March 1968, 16,500 feet down. Years later, engineers and deckhands bet their lives on steel that remembered every wave. In back offices, one wrong stamp could kill the mission. We're not here to worship hardware. We're here to track legitimacy, the Cold War's quiet currency. Azorian cost about $800 million in 1974. The real price was psychological. If Washington could raise a Soviet missile sub without starting a war, what else could it reach? In Moscow, if you can't answer that, you start spending on ghosts. Roadmap. Pillar Eye finding the ghost. A split-second acoustic bang on March 8, 1968, triangulated by SOSUS and Air Force hydroacoustic sites, put a box on the map. USS Halibut photographed the wreck. That's the treasure map. Pillar II building the lie. Howard Hughes, summer, global marine, manganese nodules, and a phrase born of leaks. We can neither confirm nor deny. The Glomar answer became policy armor. Pillar III, the claw. Clementine, built in secret inside the submersible barge HMB-1. Riser pipes stacked 60 feet at a time into a 3-mile string, heave compensation, fighting the Pacific. Then the Voyage, the descent, contact, and a lift that almost worked. Between seabed and daylight, grabber arms failed. Most fell back through 3 miles of night. What stayed changed everything. A forward hull segment, nuclear-tipped torpedoes, design truths, 6 sailors buried at sea with honors. This isn't spectacle. It's method. Raise a piece of your opponent, force them to question what you touched, and make that uncertainty expensive. The last transmission, how K-129 vanished. Midnight came and went with no radio check. In the Soviet Pacific Fleet's log, that box was supposed to fill itself. A routine burst from K-129 as she crossed the 180th meridian on March 8, 1968. It didn't. The watch stood a little straighter. No panic yet. Bursts slip, atmospherics play tricks. Then a second missed window. By dawn, staffs were on secure phones, and within hours, aircraft were clawing north from Kamchatka, searching water so vast it might as well have been blank paper. On paper, K-129 was simple. A Gulf II diesel-electric ballistic missile submarine, Project 629, upgraded to fire R-21 submerged. Old in concept, modernized in teeth. She carried nuclear-tipped torpedoes, conventional fish aft, and 3 missiles in the sail. Her crew knew their lanes and their silence. Families did too, when to expect a call, when to stop asking. Inside the American system, something else started moving. The North Pacific SOSUS arrays, seabed ears from a DAC to the Aleutians, got a nudge. Review last night. Anything odd? Air Force AFTAC hydroacoustic sites checked their tapes. It wasn't a conversation. It was a split-second bang, an isolated implosion just before midnight. 4 sites heard it. Draw lines of bearing. Where they crossed, a box appeared in the open ocean, roughly 1,560 miles northwest of Hawaii, about 3 miles deep, hundreds of miles from where Soviet search grids were already combing. The Soviets didn't have SOSUS. They had intuition, patrol plans, and the pressure of politics. Surface ships threw wakes across the wrong squares. Long-range flights burned kerosene over a rumor of coordinates. Inshore, officers filed updates that said little beyond continuing search. The silence inside apartments said more. A wife boiled tea she didn't drink. A son wore a uniform cap that didn't fit yet and asked when his father's boat would call. Nobody answered. 3 weeks, no check-in. Concern hardened into loss. The Soviet Pacific quieted, then returned to normal because operationally it had to. Officially, K-129 was declared lost with all hands. Unofficially, nobody stopped watching that patch of ocean. On the American side, the box became a plan. You don't sail a destroyer over a grave and hope. You send a camera with a brain. USS Halibut, a quiet spy sub with a tethered sled, moved to the box like a surgeon. After tracks, turns, and dead reckoning, the first ghost appeared in grainy black and white, a twisted hull section amid scattered debris on silt that puffed like smoke. The conning tower was broken. The bow lay separate. The missile hatches told a story. Something violent happened fast. Clues stacked, crushed plates, torn cabling, a fractured sail, enough to make analysts argue for years. An explosion in a missile tube, a catastrophic hull failure, a collision with the surface or another boat. Theories multiplied because truth died with the crew and the ocean never testifies. What mattered in that moment wasn't cause, it was opportunity. The wreck wasn't confetti. A significant forward section was intact. If you could reach it, you could learn. Meanwhile, back in Kamchatka, the paperwork moved on. Official condolence, unit transfers, a memorial speech that said the right phrases without naming the wrong questions. Men who'd stood pier watches with K-129's crew found themselves on different hulls. Maintenance chiefs inventoried what had been sealed before departure. One wrote in a margin, 2 nuclear torpedoes loaded, then crossed it out and recopied the line without detail. Not because anyone would read it. Because habit survives heartbreak. Halibut's photos came home quiet. A model appeared in a windowless room under a light. A foot-long K-129 rendered in painted plastic with chalk marks where metal had bent under pressure. Somewhere else, someone held a ruler over a print and did math. If you could build a hand 3 miles long, gripping a hull under 16,500 feet of water, it might come up. The lift mass, the clawed geometry, the pipe string, the heave compensation, problems, each with a price. But the box on the map had turned from rumor into wreckage you could see. In intelligence work, that's the moment a wish becomes a program. The Soviets' search faded into routine patrols. Families learned not to ask at the marketplace if anyone had heard anything. At Rybachi, a young officer walked past an empty berth and didn't look. Somewhere in Moscow, a staff memo about missing bursts got filed under code no one would open in public for decades. Here, what nobody on either side said out loud. The ocean had already talked. A single implosion stitched together by hydrophones turned a tragedy into coordinates. Those coordinates gave a camera a job. The camera gave a hand its target. By the time the Hughes Glomar Explorer left Long Beach, the last transmission wasn't a voice at all. It was a split-second bang caught at 11:59 and change, replayed in rooms where no one raised their voices, and where a plan to raise the dead stopped being crazy and started being budgeted. The metadata war, SOSUS, hydrophones, and the ghost map. To outsiders, SOSUS sounded like science fiction, miles of hydrophones on the seafloor. Inside the program, it was physics with a pencil. You didn't hear a submarine. You stacked hints, a low-frequency impulse here, a line of bearing there, faint energy moving the way steel moves through deep water. The March 8 bang wasn't poetry. It was a data point that let analysts draw a box and say, look here. Start with the ears. The fixed arrays, long lines of hydrophones anchored to basalt and cabled ashore, fed NAVFACs in places like Adak. Operators watched LOFAR waterfalls for behavior that refused to be weather. The Air Force's AFTAC stations added their own triangulation from great circle paths that bent around temperature layers. Lines crossed. The box tightened. It wasn't magic. It was metadata, time, frequency, bearing. What nobody wrote in a memo was the discipline. SOSUS trained you to distrust drama. Storms smear low bands. Shipping throws harmonics that pretend to be important. The job was subtraction. Strip out wind, remove merchant screws, ask what remains stubborn. That's how the good-sized bang rose out of ocean hiss. 4 sights heard it. Different bearings, same night. Draw the geometry and you get the grade. Then the map expanded. The US didn't guess at deep currents, it measured them. Oceanographers handed over sound velocity profiles, how temperature and pressure bend waves, which let analysts predict how that impulse would propagate. The model said the source lived near 40 north, on the 180th meridian, in water around 16,500 feet deep. The metadata became geography. Geography became a task order for Halibut. Meanwhile, something else was happening in the noise: pattern recognition. Once Halibut's photos confirmed the wreck inside the SOSUS box, the system learned what success felt like. Arrays that had looked like static started to look like a history book. Analysts pulled old reels, reran filters, and found faint clues they hadn't known to trust. Not more bangs, shadows that matched the debris field's implied path. The ghost drew itself darker the longer you stared. And here's the quiet twist. SOSUS wasn't built to find graft. It was built to hear patrols. That habit mattered. When you tune your brain to track slow steel moving against low bands, a sudden impulse stands out. The metadata war wasn't about a single event. It was about teaching people to see consistency in a sea of exceptions. By the time K-129's box was drawn, crews at a DAC could name storms by their signature and tell a freighter from an ice breakup by the way the waterfall breathed. Onshore, the ghost map turned bureaucratic. The acoustic fix drove requirements: a region to cover, dwell times to meet, a sensor package Halibut could drag without snagging the world. Navy ocean engineers sketched tow patterns like farmers planning furrows, offset lines to cover the box efficiently, with overlaps to catch what luck would miss. It looked boring on a board. It wasn't, 3 miles down where silt blooms on a camera's glass. What nobody on the Soviet side could see from their search grids was that metadata trumped mass. You could throw ships and aircraft at a rumor until fuel ran dry, or you could let 4 ears give you a square that fit on a chart, and then send 1 submarine to do quiet work precisely. The United States chose the square. That choice became habit. Trust the faint line that crosses identically in 4 places more than the loud line that argues for attention. There was friction. Early on, one SOSUS report put a bearing a hair wrong thanks to a calibration drift. It would have widened the box in the worst direction. An operator with coffee breath and a pencil behind his ear caught the wobble by feel, not theory. Storm noise had a softness this line didn't. He made them rerun it. The bearings shifted back. Halibut's model later said that half degree mattered. Nobody got a medal. Someone wrote "check cal drift" on a whiteboard and underlined it twice. By the time Halibut sailed, the ghost map had layers. The acoustic fix, the current models, the towed sled's depth and field of view, the estimated debris arc if the hull broke on descent. That stack wasn't romance. It was insurance. Each layer ate uncertainty until a commander could say execute and believe it wasn't a coin flip. That's the metadata war's real prize: confidence without noise. And the payoff didn't end with one box. The discipline born in the K-129 hunt, the subtraction, the humility, the insistence on behavior over headline, bled into everything IUSS did afterward. It taught the watchers that absence can be information when you know what ought to be present, and that a single good line drawn twice is worth 100 bad dots. The ocean was still chaos, but the ghost had a map now, and the map fit. The Howard Hughes cover, Glomar shells, and the mining myth. While engineers sketched claws and pipe strings in windowless rooms, somebody had to answer a basic question. How do you sail a 619-foot ship to the middle of nowhere and sit on a grave without the Soviet Navy asking why? You don't. You invent a reason so big and so eccentric it sounds boring. Enter Howard Hughes. Hughes brought 3 things that made the lie work. First, a plausible obsession: manganese nodules, those potato-sized ore lumps scattered across abyssal plains. Second, a corporate labyrinth, Summer Corporation at the top, Global Marine as the operational face, layers of contractors beneath. Third, a reputation for secrecy that read like camouflage. If anyone asked why the richest hermit on Earth wanted a prototype mining ship, His answer would be, because I can. The paper war started years before steel hit water. Contracts framed in industry jargon, feasibility studies with real math about nodule yields, and lease applications for seabed tracts turned fantasy into filings. Global Marine, already respected for deepwater drilling, took point. They talked riser technology and heave compensation without lying. A mining system and the CIA's lift looked uncomfortably similar. That was the point. If you saw a moon pool that opened like a garage door and pipes stacking 60 feet at a time, you'd think drilling rig, not spy crane. Summer handled burn rates engineered to make suspicion feel gauche. Between 1971 and 1974, the project burned roughly $800 million, about $4.9 billion today. It bought design teams, steel by the acre, the Sun 800 crane, and a floating barge with a secret, HMB-1. Built in Redwood City, California, HMB-1 was a submersible box with a retractable roof. Inside, Lockheed teams assembled the capture vehicle, Clementine, in total cover. In spring 1974, HMB-1 met the Glomar Explorer off Catalina. The barge sank, opened its roof. Glomar opened its moon pool. A claw the size of a building slid into a ship without anyone on shore seeing a thing. The cover story wasn't just logistics, it was theater. Press packets sold seafloor mining as the next big thing. Journalists toured selected spaces and wrote what they would show. Hughes's mystique did the rest. If he skipped cameras, that felt normal. If his spokesman went bland, that felt on brand. The ship's lines, boxy, crane heavy, looked like function over form. No bristling antennas, no weapons, just an American oddity with research flags and marine science talk. OPSEC ran on economics. Crewing rosters mixed real mariners and CIA staff masked as global marine hires. Vendors shipped parts to shell locations. Invoices described mining systems, not intelligence tools. When a component needed a military-grade tolerance, a procurement clerk wrote prototype requirement and backed it with a spec sheet dense enough to end the conversation. Even failure modes rehearsed as mining hiccups. If a journalist asked about downtime, a Glomar flak could cite bearing issues in a novel riser application and sound honest. There was legal armor too, born of paranoia and good lawyering. Freedom of Information Act requests about the ship triggered a new phrase. We can neither confirm nor deny, the Glomar answered. It started as a response script to protect classified facts without lying. It became policy, then doctrine. The phrase outlived the ship, taught across agencies as a way to hold the line between curiosity and exposure. A leak didn't just threaten a mission, it threatened the habit of silence. Meanwhile, the Soviets had eyes. Trawlers with antennas loitered. A research ship in a square nobody bothered with before drew attention. But the mining myth gave them a story they could sell upstairs. It fit biases, Americans as techno-capitalists chasing minerals under flags of convenience. When a Soviet officer radioed a report back home, he said what he saw, a platform laying and retrieving pipe through a central well. He didn't say claw, because he couldn't see it. The Voyage choreography leaned into the eye. Deck drills staged as ore handling. The crew moved fabricated nodule bins, tested cranes, logged fake recovery cycles. Night ops masked real work. Aviation signatures looked like logistics flights. Signals discipline made noise look like commerce. Routine checks, weather traffic, maintenance calls that matched an industrial profile. Still, cover stories are brittle. In 1974, as Glomar worked the site, rumors traveled. Reporters smelled contradiction in mining economics, asked why a first-of-its-kind ship went to a patch with poor nodule density. The answer was volume. Test sites vary. Prototypes prove systems. It bought time. Inside Intel buildings, Glomar's success became a quiet referendum on statecraft. Build a functioning industry to hide a single objective. Spend real money as camouflage. Bury a hand under a laboratory of cranes and call it research. The risk felt surgical. If you pulled it off, you didn't just take steel off the bottom. You wrote a playbook. If you were Moscow and you couldn't prove the lie, you had to treat it as truth. That uncertainty cost fuel and budgets. Then the leak hit. On March 18, 1975, Jack Anderson broke the story. The Hughes mining ship was a CIA Trojan horse. The second phase, Project Matador, died on a byline. The Glomar answer went from form letter to cultural artifact. The cover had done its job exactly once, but once was enough to show a new kind of weapon, legitimacy engineered. You didn't have to outgun an adversary if you could out-imagine them and leave them arguing in a conference room about whether they'd been robbed. Clementine, the mechanical hand that shouldn't exist. Engineers hate the word impossible. They replace it with load paths and safety factors, then ask for thicker steel. Clementine started as that kind of refusal. On a drafting table, it was a rigid cage as long as a building is tall, with articulated jaws meant to wrap a broken hull 3 miles down and not let go. On paper, the loads were savage. A forward section of K-129 weighing hundreds of tons in water, then thousands once you start it moving, multiplied by heave and surge from a living ocean clawing at a 3-mile lever. They built her with a magic trick. Lockheed crews assembled Clementine inside HMB-1, a submersible barge with a roof that opened underwater. Redwood City workers called it a warehouse that dived. Inside, beams were marrying steel, ultra-high-strength alloy chosen because ordinary plate would yield before the first lift ticked 10 feet. The jaws were more than hooks. They were fingers on trunnions, driven by hydraulic rams on compliant mounts so the shock of contact wouldn't crack the frame. Everywhere, load spreaders, gussets, redundant pins. It looked overbuilt until you remembered the riser above it, a pipe string that would turn that mass into a violin string for the Pacific to pluck. Think of the rig like a vertical drilling system run backward. Riser pipes, 60-foot joints with tool joints the size of trash cans, stacked one by one through the moon pool, locked, pressure tested and lowered, the whole column guided by a heave compensator to cancel the ship's breathing. Build to 3 miles, and a simple problem turns cruel. Every joint adds weight and flex. The column wants to whip. The ship wants to roll. The hull wants to swing like a pendulum. They solved it with cadence. Lower on the trough, pause on the crest, and a passive active ballet. Pneumatic accumulators eating heave, drawworks paying out and picking up like a patient angler. At the bottom, Clementine needed eyes and touch. Cameras in pressurized housings peered through black water. Sonar painted the wreck as a ghost until floodlights made it real. The approach had to be millimeters honest, because the Gulf's sail and fractured bow were traps. Clip the wrong edge, and you shear metal that's waited 6 years to betray you. The test program rehearsed with steel mock-ups. They proved what theory hinted. Jaws must land clean, load must equalize fast, and any twist in the first seconds writes disaster into the next hour. Failure modes haunted checklists. Twist off at depth. The riser turning against a stuck capture vehicle got a whole section. Buckling in compression under dynamic load wrote another. Jaw fracture under asymmetric moment, an engineer's way of saying 1 finger bears the sin of 10, kept welders awake. So Clementine's beams got thicker at the knees. The jaw latches doubled. Strain gauges dotted the frame like freckles. Up top, the control room wore its paranoia openly. Analog meters for every joint tension, recorders scratching traces onto paper, crewmen watching needles like heart surgeons. Then came the hardest part, trusting steel against water. The Glomar's heave compensation had limits. If weather forced a stall mid-lift, the whole column hung in a gray zone, tension high enough to stretch steel, low enough to bang. Choices were ugly. Push and risk a snap. Hold and cook fatigue into every joint. They wrote procedures for weather windows and still learned in place. Sometimes you ride a sea you didn't forecast. Micro stories made it human. A pipe hand fought the torque of a 60-foot joint in the moon pool at 3 a.m., boots slick with spray, feeling the column hum a note you don't teach. A hydraulics tech bled a line on Clementine's elbow while the barge hatches sweated salt, whispering to a ram that would wake at 16,500 feet. A structure's lead rubbed a finger over a weld toe and didn't like the radius. He sent it back, earned a curse, saved a day. When Clementine finally kissed K-129, the physics turned slow. Jaws closed. Load crept onto the frame, then up the riser, then into the Glomar's bones, steel side. The ship's Sun 800 crane took strain like a sentinel. A man in headphones called numbers calm as weather as the column rose inches, then feet. The plan had worked where plans go to die in the first inches, where slop turns into swing. For hours, the system ran as drawn, pipe up, break out, stab, do it again. The riser sang different notes as depth changed, a music the crew learned to fear and respect. And then the nightmare clause you can never delete, fracture. Somewhere between bottom and daylight, grabber arms failed. A section of K-129 tore away and fell, a slow-motion death 3 miles long. The men on deck didn't see it, they felt it. A tension drop that shouldn't exist, a groan the whole system made when a promise broke. They kept the peace that stayed in the cage because that's what steel and humans do. Later, investigators would trace cracks and rerun films and argue whether it was material, geometry, or fate. On deck that day, Clementine had done the impossible and tasted the limit in the same breath. Here's the thing people miss. Calling it a claw understates it. Clementine was an ecosystem. Metallurgy, hydraulics, control theory, oceanography, and human nerve braided into a hand that could feel and lift through 3 miles of night. It shouldn't have existed. It did, long enough to bring a secret into daylight, and to prove that sometimes the difference between audacity and hubris, security lanes that holds one wave long and a floating lie. They didn't sprint to the grave. They rehearsed the lie in daylight where cameras could see it. The Hughes Glomar Explorer cast off from Long Beach with research flags, decks arranged like a factory, and a crew drilled to make mining look routine. Route planners bent track lines through shipping lanes to hide the wake, then doglegged into blue emptiness when no one watched. The choreography started before open water. Test lifts in the moon pool, nodule bins staged on deck, camera angles managed for any lens that got curious. Across the Pacific, Soviet trawlers with antennas like hedgehogs idled inside boxes they were told to cover. They'd been warned about American ears, not American hands. To them, the Glomar looked like a cousin of rigs they already tracked. Cranes, pipe handling, a central well. Suspicion came in bursts. Reports went home that read like weather. Unusual platform engaged in pipe-laying operations. The cover story did its job. It gave a naval staffer a sentence to read to a superior who didn't want a mystery, just a category. OPSEC was muscle memory by then. The voyage schedule never matched any internal memo that could be foiled later. Crews split into silos, global marine hands who knew mining systems, and CIA techs who spoke in maintenance. The radio plan turned signal into camouflage, logistics check-ins that sounded like industry, position reports that matched the cover sheet, weather calls that nailed the tone of tedium. Aircraft flights hugged the story too, parts delivered at plausible times. No sudden flurries that would draw lines in a Soviet plot room. The floating lie had layers. At night, under blackout curtains in spaces that never showed on any tour, the real work moved. Test fits of Clementine's telemetry, checks on the heave compensators' accumulator banks, drills that ended with decks washed down and gear returned to where a journalist's eye would expect it. By day, deckhands moved dummy or carts, ran forklifts, greased fittings that didn't matter, and waved to trawlers that drifted close enough to smell coffee. You don't hide everything. You make what's visible look so normal it becomes boring. Route choices mattered because the ocean keeps receipts. The track to the site, roughly 1,500 miles northwest of Hawaii, bent around weather windows and sonar lines. The Glomar's heave had limits. A bad swell turns a riser into a whip. Navigation plotted patches of calmer water like stepping stones. The lie had to survive the physics. If the ship pitched too hard on camera, a Soviet analyst could ask why a prototype miner was working in conditions that made no commercial sense. So they idled when they had to and invented maintenance when the sea made decisions for them. Meanwhile, Soviet interest rose by increments. A fish processing trawler loitered too long and logged too much. Another, painted like a working boat but heavy with radio masts, cut across the Glomar's bow twice in 3 days. The counter wasn't aggression. It was demonstration. Deck drills kept rolling, a crane lifted nothing important, and a flack on the sat phone gave a line about seabed assay protocols to anyone who asked. If you're being watched, let the watcher see what they expect. There were scares. One night, a shadowed hull crept within a mile, lights blacked, a sound that didn't match fishing. The bridge dimmed to red. The pipeline paused. Signals discipline tightened until you could hear the ship breathe. Then the intruder edged off, either satisfied or bored, and the Glomar resumed a cadence that felt like prayer. The Pacific is big, paranoia is bigger. The crew learned to measure fear in decibels. The louder the lie, the calmer the hands. Security lanes didn't end at waterline. Inside cabins, briefings gave phrasebooks, not secrets. What to say if a stranger in a bar asked about your job, how to shut down a conversation that wants to become an interview. Pay stubs matched the fiction. Shore leave came with buddy rules and a list of bars to avoid. A man who liked to talk got rotated off shift and back to a desk in Long Beach. Not punishment, insurance. The turning point wasn't dramatic. It was a day the horizon stayed empty and the ship took the box like a man sitting down in an old chair. Positioning over the wreck zone was its own stealth. Dynamic positioning thrusters whispered in pulses that felt like heartbeat, keeping steel centered over coordinates SOSUS had drawn and Halibut had photographed. If the lie had cracked, this was where it would have shown. Too many eyes, too much time in one square. It didn't. The Soviet Navy had ships. It didn't have proof. The cover story held because it was competent. You can fake a press release. You can't fake a 3-mile riser unless you know how to build one. A micro story landed in the log. A pipe transferred 30 seconds faster than the drill plan, then again, until the column moved with a rhythm the crew could feel in their feet. Someone wrote, "Good cadence, no chatter in the margin." That sentence meant the lie had survived the voyage. The ship was where it needed to be, unseen in plain sight, ready to lower a mechanical hand into night, while the world watched a miner pretend to mine. They'd gotten there by not flinching when curiosity sailed by burning real money on fake ore, and by trusting that a story told well enough, often enough, at the right volume becomes a shield. The ocean gave them weather. The Soviets gave them eyes. The Glomar gave them time. Now the descent would decide whether the lie could carry weight. First descent, touching the dead. They didn't lower a claw. They lowered a calendar of risks. Riser joints, 60 feet each, came out of their racks like clockwork, swung over the moon pool, stabbed, talked, tested, and sent down in a ritual the crew could do blind if the ocean ever let them. Above, the Glomar's heave compensation breathed in slow pulses, accumulators swallowing the ship's rise and fall so 3 miles below a steel hand wouldn't jerk like a puppet. Every deckhand knew the first truth of a deep lift. You win or lose in the first hour, where slop becomes swing. The column took its own personality around 400 joints. Tension gauges drew inked lines that climbed and settled, a heartbeat in paper. Watchstanders called numbers without adjectives. Top drive load 2.3. Riser tension good. Heave within band. Down in red-lit spaces, hydraulics tech swept air from lines that fed Clementine's rams, whispering apologies to fittings older than some of the men. If a bubble rode a line to depth, it would compress to nothing and still be a problem. The Pacific argued. A crosswell laid a slow roll on the ship you couldn't see until a coffee cup slid exactly an inch. The compensator hummed a note nobody liked. Procedures said pause, where the forecast said brief window. Adrenaline said keep going. The shift lead chose boring over brave and took 5. That restraint wrote luck into the next hour. When they resumed, the column settled into a cadence that sounded like confidence if you didn't listen too hard. 200 feet from bottom, the ship got quiet. The riser dropped the high notes and went dark, a bass thrum in your shoes. Cameras warmed in their housings. Lights waited. The capture vehicle's sonar painted smudges, ghosts hardening into lines, lines into edges. The wreck lived where SOSUS said it would, where Halibut had photographed a broken shape years earlier. Now the hand could see it. They threaded the needle by millimeters. Clementine's cage drifted like a slow balloon, corrected by thrusters that had never breathed this deep. The first light washed nothing, brown water, silt motes, a headache of backscatter. Then the beam found steel, a curve of hull plating, torn like paper along a weld line. The sails stump, scabbed in growth. A hatch rim that made stomachs flip because if you hit it, the load path would turn evil. The men in the control room spoke in half sentences the way you do in a delivery room. Down a tick, touch on 3, Hold, hold. Micro stories stitched the moment into people. A camera operator, knuckles white on a joystick, pushed a floodlight off glare and found a Soviet star barely visible under a skin of rust. He didn't say a word. A structures engineer muttered a math line to himself he hadn't used since grad school. A deckhand who'd never seen a submarine outside of a movie reached into his pocket and touched a St. Christopher medal he'd sworn he didn't carry. Contact was not a clank, it was a sigh. Jaws met steel and waited while load crept from appendage to frame to riser to ship. The first pounds were lies, the next hundreds were promises. The first thousands told you if design was pride or prudence. Gauges marked a slow progression, green into yellow without flirting with red. A pin took more than its share, and an alarm chirped once, then shut up when a parallel ram equalized. The control lead breathed out like he'd been underwater. There was a second voice in the room nobody could name. 6 years of silt letting go, blooming into the lights, and then back into dark. Clementine tested its grip with inches, not feet. The cage lifted the hull's forward section as if asking permission. The wreck answered by staying inside its arms. Above, the Glomar shivered a little as the physics reached deck. A man on the drawworks thumbed steel the way a guitarist touches a string between songs and nodded at a note only he knew. Then the human moment nobody wrote in the log. Out of the camera's cone, a rectangle drifted past, paint long gone, Cyrillic embossed in plate. Someone leaned toward the screen, found an edge, and realized it was a locker door. It spun once like a coin and settled in the silt someone had lived with. No one said crew. Everyone thought it. A bosun on the pipe deck wiped his nose with a grimy sleeve and blamed the cold. The ship fell into the metronome of ascent. Pipe up, break out, stab, repeat. Above the waterline, deckhands traded jokes like talismans. One sleeve got caught on a tool joint, and a man laughed the laugh you used to tell fear to wait its turn. In the control room, a pencil traced riser tension like a seismograph. The line twitched when a swell undercut the compensator's best guess. The operator backed out a half-inch of stroke and stole the energy before it could become whip. Meanwhile, a long way from the Pacific, a Soviet staffer filled in a twice-weekly situation update about manganese mining. He wrote the word routine with the force of a lie, set the pen down, and watched the ink dry. He had a son who asked questions about submarines. He told the boy bedtime stories about airplanes. At depth, Clementine carried more than metal. Inside the cage, a bulkhead wept, a seam grained with salt. The camera found a curve that looked like the skin of a face but was just torn insulation. It found a number stamped into a frame that matched nothing on any American list, then matched everything. Manufacture runs, tolerance habits, the geometry of a shipyard the CIA would trace for years. You don't steal a secret and run. You hold it still and let it teach you how a rival builds. The last feet before the first joint broke surface, a theater no one sees. The column's note climbs into human hearing. Seabirds wheel in a place that didn't have a name 2 months before. A cloud's edge knifes light across a deck that smells like diesel and salt and anxiety. A tech in a hard hat counts under his breath and doesn't remember doing it. A valve leaks a little and gets tightened a quarter turn more than the manual says. This is where systems turn into nerves. The day remembered how to be day. The ship kept breathing. The dead kept their peace. And the lift that would break history later began like all hard things, quiet, slow, and human. The 16,500-foot lift, when steel remembers. They eased the column into work like a man setting a back under a beam. No hero moves, just rhythm. Pipe up, break out, stab, repeat. The drawworks sang a tighter note as weight shifted from water to steel to ship, and the heave compensator breathed on the beat, swallowing the Glomar's rise so the riser wouldn't whip its anger into the cage. Every gauge had a watcher. Every watcher had a pencil. Steel remembers, an old weld boss once said. It keeps score in hairline cracks, in pins that pretend they're fine, in rams that lie until the load asks hard. By 400 feet, the column's tension lines looked like seismograms, twitch stacked over twitch. The operator read the pattern the way you read an old friend's face. A swell undercut half a cycle. He eased, stroke a whisper. A gust pressed the bow. He fed it back into accumulators before it became a pendulum. The language was inches and seconds. Run the riser too fast, and you pump fatigue into every joint. Stall too long, and you teach steel to sag. Mid-lift, the ocean got tricky. A low-period cross swell rolled a slow barrel under the ship. The compensator hit stroke limits twice in a minute. Procedure said pause. The control lead chose grace over pride. They held, too far to drop without violence, too shallow to pretend mass didn't matter. Stabilize. Pumps thumped. Accumulators recharged. The ship found a flatter face. Resume. Clementine felt the change as a hum through her bones. Cameras showed the cage steady, the hull inside quiet, a seam weeping where no one could fix it. The first signs of trouble didn't shout. A strain gauge on a forward jaw ticked a hair over expected. A parallel reading drifted the other way as load redistributed. The structure's engineer stared at the deltas and did math he trusted more than hope. His headset clicked. Watch finger 3, taking more than model. Topside, a pipe hand joked about coffee to no one who heard him. He bled tension off a tool joint before the torque key kissed it and felt the column's song change half a tone. He didn't have the vocabulary to call it creep. He had boots and bone and a memory of line that failed once on a different deck. He set his jaw and kept his shift smooth. The riser wanted to teach a lesson about lever arms. 3 miles of pipe makes a violin string for the sea to pluck, and any blip at the surface writes poetry at depth you don't want to read. The compensator fought the verse into prose with timing and air. The drawworks man spoke in numbers that didn't tremble. He knew if his voice shook, hands would follow. Then the column remembered a wave no one had written down. It wasn't big. It was wrong. A phase shift between roll and heave put the ship's motion just off what the accumulators could predict. The system ate most of it, let some past, and that sliver ran down joints and tool shoulders into Clementine's frame like a shiver. The forwardmost grabber took more than its share for one beat too long. A crack that had been a thought became a line you could trace with a fingernail. In the control room, you hear failure before you see it. A sudden softness in tension, a breathy groan through steel, an alarm chirp that sounds apologetic. The engineer on the strain board said, no, like a prayer to a god who didn't speak allies. The jaw's gauge fell a hair, the parallel climbed. The load redistributed enough to keep the cage honest, not enough to save what had already started. There's no drama when a section lets go 3 miles down. There's a slow-motion subtraction no camera can catch through water this black. On deck, needles moved. In the moon pool, a whisper of backflow lapped. Someone said, what was that? Like a man in a church who doesn't want the answer. The control lead didn't let silence bloom. Hold, stabilize, maintain cadence. Panic writes fatigue faster than weather. They kept the part that stayed, the cage and the hull still inside it, because that's what you do when a plan shivers. You save what you can save and make the math fit the new mass. Up top, the drawworks took the changed load without judgment. The compensator found a less elegant breath and made it work. The riser sang a lower note. The deckhands went quieter by a shade. Later, they would sort the fracture with magnifiers, trace beach marks back to a pin that wasn't a villain so much as a witness. They would argue about asymmetric load, about a transient the model had not predicted, about alloy purity and weld toes, and the kindness of corners. On deck in that hour, the test was simpler. Could the system, wounded and reweighted, carry what remained through 3 miles of day and mistake? A micro-story saved minutes. A hydraulics tech saw a pressure blip in a ram that fed a secondary latch and bled it before it pretended to be important. A pipe boss called for a slower bite on the next joint without waiting for the word authorized. The control lead let him have it because generals don't win long lifts, sergeants do. They reached the joint that would break water and felt the ocean sulk. The column's song stepped into human ears. The Sun 800 stood as if it understood confession. When steel remembers, it asks if you do too. The men did. They'd built margin into arrogance and found out which was which. They paid for the lesson with a drop you couldn't hear and a piece of a secret the Pacific took back like a debt settled on its schedule. The fracture, a sub breaks in the sky. The snap wasn't thunder, it was subtraction. A sliver of load slid away and the ship exhaled a breath no one wanted. The forward jaw's strain gauge blinked a number that didn't belong. The parallel gauge tried to take slack and lied about how well it could. In the control room, a pencil froze. Hold. Flat. Tone is contagious. 3 miles below, gravity remembered it was owed. A segment of K-129, steel that had outlived its crew by 6 years, and a war by many more, sheared along a tired seam and went home. It didn't tumble. It descended like a secret, carried by water thicker than history. No camera caught it. The black erased witnesses. Only numbers saw it go. Riser tension dipped. Compensator stroke found a new center, and the ship groaned with the humility of a machine that had almost done the impossible. On deck, the only sound was work. Pipe up, break out, stab, repeat. The drawworks operator didn't let his voice change. Top drive load 2.1, heave stable. A deckhand scrubbed his glove over a tool joint and felt the column's note slide a half tone lower. He looked at no one. He kept his hands where they were needed. Debris didn't explode through the moon pool. It drifted weeks later in stories told quietly. What rose that day was what stayed in Clementine's arms. A forward hull section, the torment of torn plating, the shaped geometry of torpedo rooms. A camera found a cylinder with a nose that didn't belong on a dead ship if the sea were polite. It was. Nuclear-tipped torpedoes had been sealed before the patrol. They rode up with the steel like relics wrapped in their own danger. The control lead didn't say that word into a headset. He said, "Package stable." Nerves drifted back to their posts. Bodies were not hunted. They were found. 6 remains, one moment at a time, turned from anonymity into obligation. On deck, men removed hats they'd worn like armor. A steel vault was welded for what the Pacific returned. Later, under a flag and a camera that recorded without commentary, the Glomar's crew gave sailors they'd never meet a funeral the Soviets would only learn about years after the Cold War cooled. The deck went silent the way men do when meaning interrupts momentum. Crisis management meant 2 clocks. One ticked for secrecy, the other ticked for respect. The CIA's Directorate of Science and Technology wrote in the margin of a day already frayed, "Preserve cover, preserve intelligence, preserve dignity." A memorial at sea was not a stunt. It was insurance against a future accusation that would burn hotter than any press leak. Somewhere, someone recorded serial numbers and metallurgy and frame spacing. Somewhere else, a chaplain's words folded into wind. The deck's reality didn't wait for philosophy. The fractured prize had mass and edges that didn't care about feelings. Crane crews choreographed slewing the cage into capture bay without letting a pendulum write a scar across a shipyard's pride. The Sun 800 took the changed load like a giant holding a newborn. Riser tension dropped to idle. Hatches slammed. The ocean left the moon pool with a last slap like a friendly lie. Inside, inspection teams moved fast, careful and mute. What the CIA had actually bought with the cost of a small space program sat under white lights. Soviet steel open to tape measures and cameras, weld beads you could trace with a fingernail, machinery whose bearings told you which plant supplied them, paint layers whispering production cycles. Codebooks did not present themselves. Burst transmitters did not tumble onto trays. But design truths did, the kind that OSS documents never give. How the torpedo shutters sat, how a bulkhead flexed, how thick the hull really was at the curve under the sail. Outside, the cover breathed like a patient. The press line about mining development trials got dusted and repeated without italicizing the guilt. Soviet trawlers logged a ship doing what its owners said it did. Pipe handling, moon pool choreography, cranes talking to the sky. A smudge in one report, all sheen near the hull, meant nothing to a staffer who'd never seen a heavy lift. No Soviet radio said, "They raised our dead." That silence bought time. The fractures audit started before bolts cooled. A jaw's hinge went under microscope. Beach marks unfurled like fingerprints, each crescent a wave remembered in steel. In the small circle of people allowed to see the truth, arguments stayed sober and short. Asymmetric load, transient surge, material notch sensitivity, all right and not comforting. The fixed list they wrote for a never-to-be Project Matador was precise and expensive. Then Jack Anderson's column turned engineering into archaeology. What a partial success meant became clear in rooms away from the Pacific. Moscow didn't need proof to feel exposed. If Americans could lift any piece, how much had they read? Where did uncertainty end and embarrassment begin? Budgets moved, procedures tightened, patrol routes rerouted through doubt. That was impact, an invoice measured in paranoia. On the Glomar, the day ended with steel stowed, riser racked, and deckhands so tired they forgot to light cigarettes they'd bragged about. A welder touched his hand to the vault as it slid and said nothing. A hydraulics tech, grease up to his wrist, stared at Clementine's scuffed finger and decided he loved and hated a machine in the same breath. A control lead walked into a bright room and finally let his voice shake where no one could hear it. They'd broken history and a submarine in the same hour. They kept what they could, honored what they must, and taught two countries a lesson about what the ocean grants and steals. The sub broke in the sky, not with sound, but with consequence. The lift's meaning didn't fall back to the bottom. It stayed the Glomar Doctrine, heavier than any hull policy. Leaks don't start with headlines. They begin as rumors with phone numbers attached. In early 1975, Washington felt a tremor, reporters nosing around a mining ship that smelled like intelligence. The CIA didn't panic. It rehearsed. Lawyers from the Office of General Counsel sat with operations officers and drafted a sentence that would become a shield. We can neither confirm nor deny. It read like a dodge. It was the birth of a doctrine. Here's how it worked. FOIA, new and sharp, let citizens ask for government records. A routine tool until a request named a ship that wasn't supposed to exist doing a thing nobody would admit. If the agency denied having records, it risked conceding there was something worth denying. If it confirmed records, it risked acknowledging the operation. The Glomar answer turned the table. No admission, no denial, no foothold for a second question. Silence became an instrument. Jack Anderson's story landed on March 18, 1975. Overnight, mining turned from cover to punchline, and Hill offices filled with questions. The CIA couldn't brief its way out. The read-in circle was small and staying that way. So the sentence moved from memo to mouth. A spokesman delivered it flat. Reporters blinked. The joke wrote itself. Inside, glomarize it became verb and policy. Protect sources, methods, and the habit of secrecy when any answer hands an adversary context. This wasn't just PR, it was lawfare. The Department of Justice took Glomar into court and argued that confirming or denying could itself be an intelligence disclosure. Judges listened to classified affidavits and held their noses. If the government said even the existence of records was sensitive, it could say neither. The precedent hardened. Agencies that never saw the Pacific found themselves invoking a mining ship to keep quiet about satellites, wiretaps, and liaison arrangements. There was a cost. Public trust runs on credible answers, and neither confirm nor deny feels like a smirk if you're not sitting in a SCIF. Congress pushed for oversight. Intelligence committees grew teeth in the same season the phrase took root. The dance became delicate. Classify what must be hidden, brief what must be governed, and tell the public as little as possible without insulting it. Glomar wasn't a license to lie. It was a license to refuse context. Meanwhile, the media learned to work the edges. If you couldn't crack the agency, you pressed the contractors. Summer had filings. Global Marine had invoices. HMB-1 had shipyard permits and a footprint you could photograph from a boat. The story you couldn't confirm built itself from the shavings left on a factory floor. That feedback loop, journalists mapping a black box with scraps, made Glomar feel necessary in Langley and infuriating downtown. Inside the CIA, the doctrine turned procedural. Draft answers got lawyered against a checklist. Would confirmation reveal a source? Would denial betray a method? Could a mosaic of public facts fill in what the sentence refused? Analysts learned to write around questions with neutral nouns and past tense verbs. By the time Glomar was muscle memory, officers could speak 3 minutes without offering substrate. The phrase spread beyond intelligence. Departments that never touched secrets found comfort in the shape of it. Police departments glomarized questions about surveillance tech. Regulators used the cadence to shelter investigations. A sentence born to protect an underwater crane started keeping lids on everything from wire maps to watch lists. The ethics pinched. When does necessary secrecy become reflex? Where's the line between protecting lives and protecting embarrassment? The Soviets didn't need our vocabulary to understand the pressure. They read our silence as proof. If the Americans refused context that hard, they touched more than they admitted. That inference did work for us. Doubt corrodes certainty faster than leaks. Glomar, wielded carefully, turned absence into a presence an adversary had to budget against. You couldn't plan clean patrols if you didn't know what the other side knew. You spent on ghosts. The funeral tape, the one captured on deck when 6 sailors were buried, stayed locked. Years later, when it surfaced and the CIA quietly shared it with Russia, Glomar's limits showed. Some silences expire, some do not. Policy armor shouldn't outlive its purpose. In that exchange, a grave honored, a tape returned, you can hear a doctrine breathing, not calcifying. Here's the quiet irony. Glomar grew from a mission that proved what imagination and steel can do in open ocean. The phrase it birthed taught Washington how to leave room between question and answer. As a tactic, it's elegant. As a habit, it's dangerous. Used well, it keeps lives and capabilities intact. Used lazily, it curdles into contempt. The best officers know the difference. They also know the corollary. When you ask the ocean for miracles, you owe the public clarity where you can give it and silence where you must. Glomar endures because uncertainty is currency. The sentence still buys time. It still denies adversaries a compass. It still irritates reporters on deadline and comforts case officers on phones that click. A ship that pretended to mine taught a government how to say nothing, and in saying nothing well, to say just enough. What they got: hardware, codes, and strategic value. What did they actually pull into daylight? Start with the obvious. The recovered forward section gave metallurgists a living cross-section: steel chemistry, plate thickness, weld profiles, stiffener spacing. It's one thing to guess a rival's tolerances from photos. It's another to put calipers on a Soviet bulkhead and feel where a shipyard saved time or guarded pride. Analysts traced bead patterns back to factories, matched fasteners to procurement lots, and built a family tree that said which plants fed which yards, and how often assemblies got replaced at sea. That map is leverage. If you know a pump housing's lineage, you can predict how its harmonics drift as bearings age, and where to listen next patrol. Then the weapons. 2 nuclear-tipped torpedoes rode up inside Clementine's arms. Not trophies, texts. Ordnance teams unwrapped them like careful thieves, reading fused trains, safety interlocks, and environmental sensors. You don't dismantle a warhead for fireworks. You take notes on handling signatures, on the fragility of certain seals, on how a Soviet weapons officer must work under pressure. That's doctrine in hardware. It also gave bomb designers in New Mexico a first-hand look at packaging choices under Soviet regulations, a quiet way to calibrate your own assumptions. Now the gray area, crypto. The myth says codebooks fell out, a cipher machine rolled onto the deck, and NSA danced. The truth is colder. The code room likely went back to the bottom with the broken hull, but not all secrets live behind one door. The forward section gave communications teams cabinets, cabling runs, burst transmitter mounts, and paperwork glues, routing sheets, update schedules, laminations that survive water if sealed. Even if a page dissolves, a metal stencil tells you format. Even if a machine is missing, bracket geometry tells you what used to sit there: size, weight, access. SIGINT analysts don't need a Rosetta Stone when they can validate timing patterns and hardware interfaces. The Hall let them tighten their attacks on short burst traffic, clocks, framing, padding. Enough to boost confidence in what they were already breaking around the edges, and to flag what lines had to be protected, because now the other side might suspect you de-seen the rack. For naval architects, the prize was failure, documented. Deformed plates at the sail, fractures around missile hatch shear lines, buckling at specific radii, clues you can't reverse engineer from a blueprint. That forensic read taught more than construction. It taught limits. If a Gulf's forward frames collapse this way under given pressure spike, you can model how later designs might carry similar stress, where to aim an implosion in war games, where to cushion in your own builds. Design truths, one engineer called them. They travel. The softer value lived in the torpedo room. Valve banks, cable trays, shock mounts, the ergonomic logic of Soviet maintenance. You don't get that from overhead imagery. You get it from crawling a space and learning a rival's taste, which lines are redundant, which brackets are overbuilt, which access panels are a lie. You carry that forward into tactics. If damage control looks this way on a Golf, you can mock it accurately in a simulator and teach your crews how a wounded enemy fights. Then there are remains. 6 sailors returned with the steel. The funeral at sea wasn't staged for politics. It built a receipt you could cash in later, proof there was honor in the theft. Decades on, when a tape of that burial surfaced and the CIA shared it with Russia, it softened one old bruise. That matters for policy, even if it doesn't move a needle on a chart. So was it worth 800 million? Critics said no missiles, no jackpot waste. But intelligence isn't a lottery, it's compound interest. The metallurgical data fed signatures. The torpedo internals hardened countermeasures. The comms hardware refined SIGINT targeting. The interior layouts improved training. Each piece narrowed error bars. And error bars are where wars tilt. If Moscow thinks you might have touched code infrastructure, even if you didn't, everyone in that chain gets spooked. Procedures tighten, audits multiply, budgets swell. Doubt is expensive. That was part of the take. Meanwhile, a secondary benefit unfolded in reverse. The Soviets saw themselves reflected. If a single ship under cover of mining could harvest a segment from 16,500 feet, what else could it reach? They rewrote patrol routes, shuffled refits, chased quiet with money they hadn't planned to spend. The lift's strategic value wasn't just knowledge, it was tempo. You force an adversary to react to an uncertainty they can't bound, and you buy time. Time to move assets, to sift traffic with sharper filters, to teach your crews what the inside of the other side feels like. In the end, Azorian's intelligence haul didn't come wrapped in vaults. It came as a blueprint written in scratches. Materials, manufacturing, weapons packaging, communications plumbing, human habit. You don't brag about that on a podium. You build a better library, quiet your own boats where their boats were loud, write doctrine with fewer guesses, and let your opponent pay the tax of not knowing which parts you truly touched. That's strategic value in a war run on uncertainty. That's what they got. The Soviet side, shock, adaptation, and doctrine shifts. In Moscow, the first reports didn't say theft. They said anomaly, American, research, ship, unusual operations, persistent station keeping where nobody mined anything. At the Pacific Fleet staff, officers who'd flown the hopeless search in 1968 understood the bruise beneath the phrasing. If the Americans found the grave, they measured more than water. When Jack Anderson's story broke in March 1975, the euphemisms snapped. A vice admiral tapped a pencil on a chart until the point flattened. Assume compromise. Shock made 2 kinds of noise. Publicly, a stiff press line about desecrated grave and imperial provocation. Privately, panic translated into taskers, immediate reviews of patrol patterns, communications discipline, and yard practices. The first order sounded deceptively simple. Treat everything touched by K-129 as suspect. Codes, burst timing, equipment mounts, even the way a cable bent around a bulkhead. Crypto officers pulled night shifts shredding and reissuing, rotating one-time pads, and rewriting burst schedules in Windows so tight even friendly net managers cursed. The SIGINT fear wasn't that the Americans had a magic machine. It was that they'd validated guesswork. Validation changes how you sleep. Fleet doctrine shifted fast in the places paper doesn't show. Ballistic missile boats avoided the old, safe, boxes like they were cursed, sliding patrol arcs into new water where patterns couldn't be compared against Halibut's photos or Glomar's lift. Captains who'd run straight legs between datum points now ran doglegs and crescents, accepting fatigue to destroy habits. Acoustic hygiene got religion. Engineering chiefs tightened acceptance tolerances on pump and gearbox replacements, knowing a single sloppy run in winter could write a lifetime signature. Crews drilled throttle discipline, no lazy sweeps near exits, no pretty maneuvers for watchstanders. Shipyards felt the blow like an audit with teeth. Metallurgy reviews hit plate vendors and marriaging stock, not to match the Americans, but to erase tells. Weld toes got ground smoother on frames under the sail because the failure on the Gulf's forward section made inspectors see stress everywhere. Gear cutters recalibrated jigs twice as often and logged it like confession. Prop shops chased cavitation with new blade edges, hoping to bury blade rate tones under lower, cleaner hum. Nobody said Clementine. Everyone said compliance. On the comms side, bursts shrank. Transmit windows narrowed to blinks. Routing overlays changed ports for updates on a cadence designed to annoy, because annoyed men make fewer predictable choices. A young signals officer who'd spent 3 years perfecting schedules wrote a new plan that looked like a scatterplot and watched his colonel sign it without comment. He went home and told his wife he'd be sleeping at his desk. She didn't ask why. Doctrinally, paranoia became prudence. Exercises introduced American lift as a scenario variable. What if they can salvage your secret and show it to a committee? That makes political officers talk in lectures about vigilance. It also makes line officers change how they brief. Assume the adversary has eyes where you don't, became a refrain. The culture hardened a notch. Pride still lived in steel, but it learned to hide in darkness slightly differently. There was a human ledger the Soviets didn't put on slides. Families who'd accepted silence as the price of service had to absorb a stealthier grief. A tape of a burial at sea existed in a foreign vault. Years later, when it was shared quietly with Russia, it solved nothing and mattered anyway. In the interim, a widow in Petropavlovsk heard a rumor that Americans had honored her dead and didn't know what to do with that kindness. Doctrine doesn't have a box for that. Inside procurement, embarrassment turned into budgets. Quieting programs accelerated with a political cover story that mentioned Western snooping without admitting any loss. Funding flowed to raft machinery better, to tile hulls with anechoic coatings, to refine reduction gear profiles. The lessons weren't mystical. They were project plans with deadlines. If the enemy can hear your pumps age, buy pumps that age less audibly. If he knows your failure seams, move them, or teach welders to blend them like art. Counterintelligence swung wide and hit real targets and ghosts. Desk audits crawled through annex distribution lists no one had read closely since they were typed. A shipyard engineer with a gambling problem met a fate that satisfied no one and warned everyone. The better officers knew the risk of blaming humans for structural arrogance, but someone had to bleed for a word like Azorian. In the end, adaptation looked like caution turned policy. Patrol legs shorter, update cycles harsher, yard acceptance stricter, training meaner. The strategic change sat under all of it, doubt, not collapse. Soviet deterrence remained steel and range, but a new tax on confidence. If a rival could hide an industry to steal a secret and then teach your budgets to fear uncertainty, you spent years paying for a single day in the Pacific. The lesson landed in Doctrine as a sentence no one quoted. Never give the ocean a chance to make you predictable. Fallout, deep-sea mining, special access programs, and the next ruse. Azorian didn't end when Glomar docked. The wake spread in places that didn't look like espionage, trade shows, budget lines, and quiet offices that decide which projects get names and which disappear into initials. The fake mining industry didn't vanish. It morphed into something half real and fully useful. Industry first. The manganese nodule myth gave real engineers a stage. Riser pipes, heave compensation, dynamic positioning, those weren't props. Offshore drillers had wanted deeper water for years. Now they had proof under fluorescent lights. You could build a 3-mile umbilical and not snap it like cheap spaghetti. Oil companies lifted the playbook wholesale. By the late 70s, dynamic positioning sat under rigs like a second keel. Remotely operated vehicles that had shadowed Clementine's cameras grew into a fleet that mapped pipelines, inspected Blau preventers, and combed wrecks that never made the news. The HMB-1 barge itself found a second life hiding Navy hardware, because once you perfect a roof that opens underwater, you don't scrap it, you repurpose it. Deep-sea mining didn't launch the revolution the brochures promised. Market math and environmental headwinds stalled nodules as commodity, but the cover's tools paid out. Universities wrote grants for seabed resource assessments. Startups pitched polymetallic dreams with CADs that looked suspiciously like Clementine's skeleton in a hard hat. The effect wasn't hype, it was normalization. If you sailed a crane farm into blue gloom to test a riser, no admiral raised an eyebrow. The ocean got a new vocabulary: trials, prototypes, feasibility. Those words hid a lot of listening. Inside government, Azorian's real invention wasn't steel. It was a culture: spend real to hide realer. The operation fit into a budget category that would soon get sharper teeth: special access programs, not just classified, compartmented, need-to-know as architecture. Azorian's shell companies, false invoices, sealed annexes, those became teaching slides. Want to build something audacious? Wrap it in a plausible industry. Call it a pilot. Let commerce file the paperwork while the CIA writes the checks. After 1975, SAPs multiplied. They hid satellites in weather programs, drones in target tow lines, underwater arrays in oceanography. The oversight problem didn't vanish. It learned to speak in lead-lined rooms with staffers who knew the difference between curiosity and subpoena. Project Matador, the second bite at K-129, died the way secrets die, in a column inches wide. But the reflex remained. Build a ruse with its own gravity. Give it enough truth that engineers don't have to lie at lunch. Then let adversaries waste time arguing whether it's real. That method grew legs. When the Navy wanted to drag long ears across seafloors, the proposal wore a lab coat. When skunkworks packed eyes into airframes that didn't exist, test pilots flew weather. The next ruse didn't have to be maritime. It had to be believable and billable. Corporate America learned a quieter lesson. If a project's ledger reads like a hedge fund's fever dream, it might still be honest if the physics demanded. Contractors who'd built Glomar without choking on the why got calls for programs with less romance and bigger shadows. A few men kept two sets of truths. One they told auditors, one they whispered to wives. Most just did their jobs and cashed checks that arrived without explanation. There was fallout you could taste: policy. The Glomar answer bled from FOIA responses into legal muscle memory. Agencies that never touched the Pacific learned to neither confirm nor deny. That stance protected sources and methods. It also insulated mistakes. Azorian's partial success hadn't been a scandal. The leak of its ambition almost became one. Afterward, bureaucracies developed an allergy to context. The best case officers knew where silence ended and accountability began. The worst learned to wear no comment, like armor in rooms that needed candor. Meanwhile, other nations built their own floating myths. Moscow pushed oceanography that counted cables. London flew research that smelled like radar. Beijing watched all of it and started drawing plans for a decade no one in 1975 could imagine. Deep sea mining re-entered headlines dressed as geopolitics. Cobalt, nickel, rare earths. The map of the Clarion, Clipperton Zone looked like a chessboard. Some companies were real, some weren't. The ocean remembered every lie it had ever carried and kept its own counsel. There's a human thread through all this. The people who built a hand under a barge and then went to work on blowout preventers and inspection crawlers. They didn't think in doctrine. They thought in fasteners and flow. Azorian made their world bigger. So did the budgets that followed, the SAPs that hid unphotographable work with uninteresting names. If you ask them about fallout, they'll point to a heave compensator on a rig in the Gulf and say, that. If you ask an intel lawyer, they'll say, Glomar. If you ask a strategist, they'll say, template. The next ruse, it's already here. The trick isn't spotting cranes. It's seeing competence camouflaged as commerce, talent laundered through feasibility studies, and truth spending money like a company that intends to ship. Azorian's shadow lasts because it proved a brutal thesis. If you can make a lie useful, you can make it invisible. And if it works once, it writes habit. Legacy, the heist that rewired secrecy. Azorian didn't just lift steel, it lifted a mindset. Inside Langley and the Pentagon, the takeaway was we raised a sub. It was we built a believable industry to hide one objective, and it worked. That became doctrine. If the target is too sensitive to explain, invent a cover so competent it stands on its own books. Spend real money. Deliver real engineering. Let plausibility do the security. Budget culture bent around that idea. Special access programs treated deception as infrastructure, not garnish. Shell entities got better. Paper flows grew purpose-built, not sloppy. Lessons from Glomar Segregated teams, legal shields, procurement that reads like prototypes, turned into checklists for projects that would never see daylight. Engineers learned a quiet duality. You're solving physics honestly, even if the brochure lies. That kept the workforce straight, while the mission stayed crooked by necessity. Secrecy shifted from locks to ambiguity. Before Azorian, you classified facts and hoped no one asked the right question. After, you engineered answers that ate the question. Neither confirm nor deny wasn't the philosophy, it was the byproduct. The philosophy was, control the context. Own the narrative space so fully that proof looks ungainly and doubt becomes the adversary's expense line. The Navy absorbed the human lesson. Intelligence married engineering in a way that outlasted a crane. Metallurgy became signature. Interior layouts became training. Failure analysis became design, not to copy the Gulf, but to understand how your opposite number thinks under constraint. That habit, read the rival from what breaks, bled into air, space, and cyber without anyone needing to say Clementine again. Industry kept the tools and forgot the ghost. Dynamic positioning, risers, ROVs, they grew into normal kit. HMB-1 hid Navy prototypes for years because a roof that opens underwater is useful long after a lie retires. Deep-sea mining never paid out like the brochures, but it legitimized a class of vessels you can park over secrets without starting a rumor. That normalization is part of the legacy. The ocean became a lab where commerce and cover look identical from a periscope. On the other side, Moscow learned a matching reflex. Treat any American prototype as a potential mask. Audit signatures harder. Patrol like someone is listening in a way you can't see. Paranoia turned into standard operating procedure. That costs time and rubles. Azorian made uncertainty a tax. There's a cultural scene too. The burial tape mattered. Years later, sharing it acknowledged a boundary, thieves with a code. It didn't erase the heist. It showed that even inside engineered silence, small truths can travel. That nuance kept the Glomar answer from hardening into contempt. Smart officers know the difference between protecting capability and hiding error. Azorian drew that line in steel and taped funerals. The playbook survives because it scales. You can swap mining ship for weather satellite, oceanographic sensor, testbed airframe, and the rhythm stays. Build a plausible industry, seed it with real math, tuck the hand under it, and move quietly. When it leaks, let the doctrine take the hit. The capability keeps breathing. For all the machinery, the legacy is human. Deckhands who felt a violin string 3 miles long will tell you the ocean has a memory. It keeps score. Case officers who learn to Glomar will tell you silence has a grammar. It keeps faith. Engineers will tell you impossible just means heavier steel. Azorian braided those beliefs into a habit, audacity with paperwork. If you want a last receipt, listen to how people talk. Glomarize it means hold the line. Build the cover means spend like you mean it. Clementine, in certain rooms, still means do the hard thing right once. The heist didn't blind the USSR as much as it rewired us. We learned to treat secrecy as an ecosystem, law, money, metal, and story, tuned to keep uncertainty pointed the other way. Call it theft, call it theater, call it engineering with a straight face. The result is the same, a rival forced to doubt what you know for longer than they can afford. That's Azorian's bequest, not the steel we kept, but the silence we learned to shape. One fake mine ship taught a superpower that secrecy works best when it looks ordinary and spends like it's real. The lesson is simple. Uncertainty is a weapon, and doubt is expensive. Want the thread from Glomar's playbook to today's seabed contests, fiber taps, and research platforms that are? Watch the next film. Subscribe for more true operations where budgets became camouflage and engineering carried a